Hello and welcome to another edition of Turned Out a Punk. I'm your host, Damian Abraham, and once again I'm bringing you a conversation with someone who grew up listening to punk, may or may not still be involved with punk, but had their life changed by the genre in a major way. And today on the show, kind of like my boss, the guy who runs the record label that my band is on, but also a punk rock legend for several different bands he's involved in or has been involved in, including the legend Superchunk. McCaughan is here on the show. This has taken years to happen, but it finally has. More on that in 1 second. But first, if you would like to get in touch with me, head over to the email address turnedoutapunkpodcast@gmail.com. That is run by my brother and show producer and guest booker extraordinaire, Tristan Abraham, and he will get the message to me. Thank you, Tristan, for all the hard work you do for the show. You can also find me on Twitter or Instagram at Left4Damian. And if you want to support the show, the best way to support the show is just by telling all your friends about it, letting everyone know that there's this podcast, and they talk to them all. You bring them all, they'll talk to them. You can also support the show by heading over to patreon.com and checking out some of the fun stuff that happens over there. There's tons of footnotes, lost episodes, hidden episodes, a lot of videos of various episodes, because a lot of the stuff now is done on video and they go up over there on that podcast feed for the patrons, whatever they are. They are over there for them. And so you can go over there and check that out. And speaking of support, this show would not be possible without the kind, loving support of the fine folks at Vans who came aboard a few years ago and said, Damian, do what you do, just don't do it out of your own pocket. And they helped me cover the costs of doing this thing, which is, I can't thank them enough for doing. I am eternally grateful for their support for this podcast, and it allows me to keep doing it. So thank you very much to them. I play in a band too. We're called Fucked Up, and as you may have heard, sadly, our tour with Faith No More has been postponed indefinitely. The band released a statement today saying that Mike Patton is going through some mental health issues. And as someone who has his fair share of mental health issues, he has my undying empathy and sympathy for everything he's going through right now. And I wish them all the support, and I hope he gets well soon or feels a little bit better soon, and look forward to playing with them at some point down the line. Really, we were all looking forward to this tour, but obviously we get it. We will also still be playing, though, Riot Fest. So if you're coming to Riot Fest, Fucked Up will be there. Let's have a fun, safe time. Oh my gosh. That's a little ominous. Thunder rolls in. But yes, we will be at Riot Fest in Chicago. We will also tentatively be touring for the 10th anniversary of David Comes to Life, starting in January, going all over the place. You can find out more details at fuckedup.cc. David Comes to Life is being reissued by Matador Records. You can find out more information on our website at fuckedup.cc and our merch store, or probably over at Matador Records as well. You can also find out more information about Year of the Horse, our hour-and-a-half-long song, which is being released by Tank Crimes, run by our good buddy Scotty Karate, over there on their website. And finally, our singles compilation, which never came out on vinyl, is finally getting issued on vinyl by the incredible record label Get Better Records. And you can find out more information about that on their website. All right. On to today's show. Today on the show, the legend McCaughan is here. Now, Mac is someone who, as I tell him on the show, one of the first people I asked about coming on this podcast, because to me, Superchunk has always been kind of like this under-heralded, not as far as being a band. I think they're very highly regarded as a band, but under-heralded as a punk band. I've always felt they kind of get overlooked in terms of the best punk bands ever, particularly the best melodic punk bands ever, because I think Superchunk rages, and I think they're also catchy as hell. So I've always wanted to have Mac on the show. Laura obviously was on the show. Laura, the other half of Merge Records, and an incredible guest. Go back and listen to Laura's episode if you have not heard it. But Mac, and obviously John has been on the show a bunch. Jim still needs to come on the show, but Mac has been someone that I've wanted to have on the show for a very long time. and now it's finally here. I don't think there's any more reason for me to ramble on. I could go on forever just talking about Mac because there's a lot, Wwax and Slushpuppies and Portastatic. There's a lot to get to, but we cover a lot of it in the episode. So I'm going to let you hear it in the episode. But before I let you go, what would Turn Out a Punk be without a couple notes? First of all, I don't know what I was thinking. Fuck You is by the Stiffs. Here I am throwing out credit to, I forget who even I credit to in the episode, but it's by the Stiffs originally. Not to be confused with all the other bands called the Stiffs. This is the original Vancouver Stiffs, which maybe the English Stiffs predate them. That's probably why they changed their name. Also, the band that Matt can't think of later on, featuring John Morand, was Future Neighbors. And also, I just found out he recorded the Four Walls Falling LP, which is a fun fact. Cool link in the world. Okay, that's it. I'm not going to ramble on anymore. Other than to tell you that on September 24th, Mac is putting out an incredible solo record, The Sound of Yourself. I love this thing. It's fantastic. I haven't stopped listening to it since I got the link. As I say, it is coming out on the 24th of September on the home label, Merge Records. So pre-order that thing and check it out because I promise you will enjoy it. All right, that is that. Sit back, relax, and enjoy Mac McCaughan on Turned Out a Punk. Mac, thank you so much for finally coming on the show.
We've been talking about this for a long time, Damian.
Oh, you got to be one of the first people I asked about doing this thing.
Oh, no. It's taken that long.
It's taken that long. I've collaborated with you since asking you to do on this thing. We've played together
we
live.
Made a record together. We played live. Yeah.
But it has not happened. But today, finally, we made it happen. This, I think, is my brother's proudest moment because he has wanted this to happen. I've wanted this to happen pretty badly, and I think the only person that wanted it to happen more than me, perhaps, is my brother.
Awesome.
So, but we got to start this off the way they all start off, buddy, which is how did you get into punk? Do you remember the first time you ever came across the genre?
I think that the first time I was really aware of punk was just from like news. Like, if I lived in Fort Lauderdale until I was 13, and so in the late 70s, I feel like the Sex Pistols were like in the news when they came over. I didn't know what they were or anything like that. You know what I mean? But like, I feel like that was like a thing on the news, the Sex Pistols. But the first time I was really aware of like the music was, well, two things. Like I was really into like classic rock. They didn't call it that then probably, but like the Who and my dad had like Rolling Stones records and Led Zeppelin records and things like that. I was really into that, and I was really into AC/DC.
Which is kind of punk, AC/DC. Like Australia's taken up as punk.
Yeah. I mean, and I didn't know that at the time, but I was like, that was like my favorite band in like 1979, 1980. I loved AC/DC. And so I would buy any magazine that had Angus Young on the cover. And one of those magazines was often Cream magazine. And Cream also had like punk bands in there, even though I didn't really know what they were. There'd be like Pearl Harbor and the Explosions, or like, like a thing about how like hot Paul Simonon is or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, oh, like, I mean, I'm reading about this stuff, but I didn't know what it sounded like, But around that time, the radio station that I had my alarm set to wake up every morning in like 8th grade or whatever, they played Police on My Back like almost every morning, like it was in rotation. And like I loved that song, and like that, so that was really like the first like punk song that I like was aware of, or by a punk band at least. I know Eddie Grant wrote it, but like that was like my first exposure, and I was like, oh, the Clash, like I like this music, you know what I mean, even though I didn't know about the genre of punk. And I think it's so interesting, like what radio could do back then, because they weren't all owned by the same company, so like any station I guess could play whatever they wanted to some extent. And so, they were playing that song, but obviously like the Pretenders had like hits on the radio, like these bands that later you go like, oh, like they were part of this other thing, but they were being played, but they were having like these kind of like hits that you could hear on the radio, like Brass in Pocket or something like that.
Well, there's a moment where it kind of crosses over a little bit where you have like Devo and all these bands seemingly.
Oh, for sure. Devo, when that really hits on like MTV and stuff like that, or even like Cars by Gary Newman. I mean, the fact that that was like a smash hit is just like when you listen to his records at that time, like that's just such a crazy, cool thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. 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 And were there any regional kind of Florida bands that they would be playing around then? I'm trying to think of like some of the new wavy power pop stuff that would have been.
Well,
Chillas, I guess, or Cicadas.
I wasn't old enough to like go to shows. Having said that, the first rock concert I ever went to was a couple of regional Florida bands, a band called Molly Hatchet.
Yes.
And then the second concert was I went to see Loverboy,
Canada,
but they were opening for a band called Point Blank, who I think is from Florida.
Oh,
but that tour was booked before Loverboy's record came out, and so they had a hit, but they were the opening band. And so we went to see Loverboy and walked around the side of the arena and got their autographs as they were loading their gear into a van, which I'm sure they weren't in that van very long because like their song was like all over the radio. But Molly Hatchet was like the first like real rock concert I went to. Sunrise Musical Theater, and I've talked to Todd Barry, who grew up down there. He actually did see some great like new wave concerts at the Sunrise Musical Theater. Like he saw Blondie there and Elvis Costello and stuff like that. But I wasn't really exposed to that. I mean, I'd heard Blondie because they had hits on the radio, but like I didn't, I couldn't just go to a concert because I was 13. So it was like whatever my dad could take us to,
What did Point Blank sound like?
I haven't really gone back to listen in a long time, but I think they were kind of like just like rock and roll,
Also, the Chant, incredibly underrated band with Todd Barry on that one LP.
Todd Barry on drums.
Do you think that LP? To me, that LP sounds like it's like a lost Flying Nun record. Like that record could have been at home on Flying Nun.
I could see that. It's just weird sounding because of like the era and where they probably recorded it and stuff like that.
Yeah. Absolutely. So where'd you kind of go from, like going to these, where were you discovering like Molly Hatchet and stuff? Was that from Cream magazine too?
Oh, definitely like Cream and like Hit Parade or whatever, the Hit Parade, whatever that other magazine was. And Rolling Stone, of course. I would like have a subscription to Rolling Stone, but really the radio. I mean, just listening to the radio all the time. And I started buying records around then. We had a giant record store of the Peaches chain in Lauderdale. There's huge Peaches records. You'd go there. And then we moved to, and then I got a Walkman around that time. A Walkman was like, I think a gift from friends of mine when I was moving. They like pulled together and got me like the first Walkman. So then I started buying tapes. So I was listening to music all the time on my Walkman, but it was mostly again like metal and classic rock and stuff. Like I was really into Iron Maiden. I really like that band Riot. And then of course AC/DC. And then we moved to North Carolina, and my parents still talk about this. Like my main complaint about moving to North Carolina is that no bands were going to play here because like, in Fort Lauderdale, like everyone was playing in like Miami or Lauderdale or somewhere, like the arenas down there, everybody would come there, and I couldn't really go see most of the concerts, but I knew that the concerts were happening. And I was just like, oh my God, we're moving to the country, even though obviously I didn't know what I was talking about. So we moved here in 1980, and I saw one of the first concerts I saw when we moved here was Van Halen on the Fair Warning tour, which is again pretty punk record.
Absolutely, and through doing the show, I've learned that they were playing with like the Dogs, or they like the Ramones. Obviously, there's that famous Flyer, but like
that's so crazy.
Yeah, like they were part of that kind of circuit of punk bands out in LA before it got like, I guess, before it all got codified a little bit more.
Right. And then when we moved here, so I was still into that stuff, obviously, but you know, we live in a area where there's like 3 colleges, 4 colleges, um, and all in a very small area. And so like college radio is a big thing here. And colleges get tons of band. I mean, there's still like the arena, the closest arena at that time was in Greensboro, the Greensboro Coliseum. That's where a lot of the big concerts would happen, like REO Speedwagon, Van Halen, Styx, whatever, like everybody played there. Um, but the colleges had concerts also. And so that then you could see like medium-sized bands would play. And then of course there's a million clubs, in the area, which again, I wasn't old enough to go to yet, but you could hear just so much more stuff on the radio when there's college radio stations. And that's where I really started to find out about other kinds of music.
So what was some of the first stuff you're kind of picking up on from these college radio stations?
I remember, I mean, if it's funny because it also like kind of coincides with like the arrival of MTV.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I remember, MTV was, I mean, there's a great oral history of MTV. If you haven't read it, it's really awesome. And they talk about in that book, like just how short they were on content, and they're trying to be a 24-hour station. And they're just like, we'll just play anyone's video.
Yeah.
So like, yes, like what, they were playing like very mainstream things, but I remember they would always play the Kraut video. And of course Ramones and other things, like, there's just stuff mixed in, Graham Parker and the Rumor, like Elvis Costello, like all these things got mixed in there, you know what I mean? That were just like certainly not getting played on the radio, but like we just need videos. So like, yeah, we'll play this Kraut video.
It's funny because that video, I think that's a rip that's on YouTube, is an MTV rip.
Oh,
or
probably.
at least for the longest time, it had like, the little MTV stinger in the corner. But like, yeah, it's same when Much Music started up here too. It's amazing how punk and kind of, I guess, indie is always like the weather balloon for these new media things. Like I look at like the rise of social media, the rise of streaming, just how much concerts and shows were paid for or sponsored by these streaming services that now are focused on much bigger fish. But at one point it was like, oh yeah, like or Scion or like Red Bull throwing money at punk shows, like it feels like that it's kind of like the thin end of the wedge to kind of figure out all the kinks in the system before you go big. And I guess it goes back
to build your brand as something cool.
Yeah.
People like use actual cool stuff to build their brand until they move on to like bigger
yeah.
Bit, you know what I mean?
Till you don't need it.
Yeah. But so like I remember there was like a local there's like a local music show on WXYC, which is the UNC station. And XDU might have had one as well, but XYC was easier to get at our house. So they would play, local bands. And the one of the bands that they play, and they could also play like they didn't have to have records or whatever. They had carts, which is like one song thing. So like a band wouldn't even have to have official release out to get played on the radio. So that was kind of cool. You could hear these bands that are playing, but they don't even have a record out, but you can still hear what they sound like. And they'd use that to promote their shows at Cat's Cradle or wherever.
So would they record these songs at the radio station, or would you bring in a recording and they would cut the cart for you?
No, you would bring in like, cause like my band eventually in high school did that. I think that we probably brought in like a cassette of a mix or whatever. And then they put it on. It's basically looks like an 8-track tape.
Yeah.
And so, local bands that I remember hearing about at the time were obviously, Let's Active were not in our area specifically, but they were considered local because of, they're from Winston-Salem. And the Pressure Boys were from Chapel Hill. They were like a ska band, I think, that started at Chapel Hill High probably. These bands would sometimes play all ages shows at a place called the Art Center in Carborough that's currently next to the Cat's Cradle over there, but it was in a different building at the time. And they would have, so like I remember going to see the Pressure Boys play all ages shows, that like we could go to as high school kids. And Pressure Boys got really pretty big, and would also, because they were big locally, would get the opening slot for any like larger like new wave band coming to town.
Mm-hmm.
So like I saw the Pressure Boys open for Missing Persons. I saw the Pressure Boys open for Billy Idol. The Pressure Boys, I didn't go to it, but they opened for Duran Duran. Like they would just get put on these bills. They're like, oh, who's the local new wave band? But they were great. They were a great live band.
Did they put out records? Sorry, I didn't cut you off. But did they put out stuff?
They self-released a couple EPs, and then compiled those onto a CD at some point.
Okay.
But the singer for the band and trombone player for the band was John Plymall, who we made multiple records with over the years. He became an audio engineer. But anyway, so the other band that was becoming really big around this time in the South was REM. And they played shows before I was old enough to go to shows. They played at these little clubs, this place called The Station in Carborough, and probably played the Cat's Cradle too. I'm not sure, but once they started to make a name for themselves, I mean, everyone kind of claimed them. Like if you were in the South, like they were the coolest thing, you know what I mean? And they're from 6 hours away, so that's like close enough, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And other bands in their wake, like local bands that kind of sounded like REM. There's a band called 1+2 from around here. It's kind of have a jangly thing. Again, Let's Active was getting kind of known around that same time. And Mitch, who was in Let's Active, had worked with REM, produced REM.
Before that, he's in the Sneakers too, right?
Yeah, and I didn't know about the Sneakers. That was even before I moved to North Carolina. But right, he already had a whole history in Winston. The DBs, I think, had already moved to New York, but they're from around here, and so you heard them on the radio a lot, on college radio a lot, and so there was like a lot going on. Again, like couldn't go to see bands in clubs, so that was kind of made things hard to see. But obviously one of the bands that I heard on college radio, though they wouldn't play it as often as these other bands, was Corrosion of Conformity, who were from Raleigh. And I remember hearing them on the New Music Show on WXYC. The first time that I went to a hardcore show was I saw a flyer up at our high school for a show at the Duke Coffee House. I can't remember. Have you guys ever played the Duke Coffee House by any chance?
No, you know what? It's so weird. It's like, and I know, Canadians always complain about Americans' lack of knowledge of Canadian geography, but I find the cities in the Carolinas so hard to keep straight in my mind, like where I've played and where I haven't played. But no, I'm pretty sure we've never played there.
Well, you've played in Raleigh, and you've played in Carborough, which is basically next to Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
I don't know that you've ever played in Durham.
I don't think we've ever played Durham, okay. and I know I know it's not close by, but we played Charlotte a few times. Like it always seemed like we played Charlotte the most in the early years, at least.
Right. So there was a flyer for a show at the Duke Coffee House for a band called the Ugly Americans.
Yes.
And there was a band opening called The Band with No Name. And so some friend, and the coffee house is all ages because it's on campus and they don't sell alcohol or whatever. So we went to this show, and what I didn't know was that it was Ugly American's first show.
Oh, wow.
What I also didn't know was that in the Band with No Name was Chuck Garrison, our first drummer.
Oh, wild. Okay.
So like I figured that out like probably after Chuck and we'd been playing music, probably after I'd known Chuck for like years already. He was like, oh, that was my band. Like I was in that band. But anyway, so we went to this show. Ugly Americans played, and everyone from Corrosion of Conformity was in the room. And so they just got up and played a set on Ugly Americans gear. Just because
awesome.
Just because whatever, they were there and they could or whatever. So that was my first like hardcore show. That was amazing. And COC played a lot, and I never got to see No Labels. They had already, I think they were around for like a year, maybe 2 years maximum, and they had already broken up. But I saw COC not that long after play an outdoor show at Duke, on the Duke campus, and they were awesome. Like they were just so exciting, and like the music was exciting. They were exciting to watch live. Like they were just incredible, and that's really kind of what I mean. I was hooked on like punk rock at that point.
What about Stillborn Christians? Did you see them early on?
I saw the Stillborn Christians, and I think in Raleigh at probably at the brewery or somewhere over there, at one of the all ages shows. A club in Raleigh called the Brewery would have like like hardcore matinees, usually on Sundays, Saturdays or Sundays, during the day. And so I saw Stillborn Christians there, and then of course later, ended up in a band with Jeb from Stillborn Christians, and putting out his records when he was in Angels of Epistemology. Once after high school, I had a band with my friend Jonathan Newman, who played drums for the Slushpuppies, and Jonathan also played in Egg. And Egg was basically Stillborn Christians, but with Jonathan playing drums, because it was Gary and Jeb, and then with a different drummer.
I was thinking about this when I was kind of like putting everything together that I wanted to talk to you about for this episode. I've spared you from it, but I got this scary looking list of questions that I was going to get to, but I'm just flying off the top of my head back. Don't worry. But it's amazing how, I don't want, incestuous is such a terrible thing to apply to this, but like how interwoven the scene is out there. Like how many of these bands kind of have a continuance. Like there feels like the scene that would ultimately, I guess, be referred to by myself, at least from a distance, as like the merge scene. It's like, it's so much out of this hardcore scene. Like, it's just like, I don't know, it's just like one scene, just kind of like, was it like people, it just feels like such a unique thing. Cause there's like, I guess you see it in DC too, but like a lot of times there's like distinct sort of breaks in scenes, where things fall apart, people move away, but it just feels like people just kind of grew together.
I think that something I associate with that is the fact that when, you're living in a place like North Carolina, there's less of a, maybe it's just not really possible, but also like there's less of an inclination to have like a super defined scene. In other words, it's like, and this just speaking personally, like when I started hearing like alternative music, for lack of a better word, I mean, I was still listening to AC/DC and the Who or whatever, but like I was also excited about REM and Let's Active and the other bands I was hearing, and I was also excited about Corrosion of Conformity and like the punk rock bands I was hearing. So it was like, I feel like you don't have the luxury of just being like, I only listen to new wave, or like I only listen to hardcore or whatever. Like when you're in a place where you don't get everything, like if you're in New York or LA or something like that, I feel like in some ways you're more open to like whatever, because you're just like, you want to hear interesting stuff and you feel slightly outside the mainstream. So you're just like, anything that sounds cool, you're like, I'm into that, like I'm like, one of the first shows I actually got to go to the Cat's Cradle was Rain Parade. And they had played them a lot on the college radio stations. We were so psyched. That was an awesome show. But again, that wasn't really punk sounding, but it was just like different than anything we'd heard before, like on the radio, you know what I mean? Other than college radio. And so I feel like being in a place where kind of anything goes makes you just more open to anything. And so there can be more of this trajectory, like again, talking about Stillborn Christians and Jeb Bishop, going from that to Angels of Epistemology, which doesn't sound anything like that, you know what I mean? But it's all part of the same scene, and other people in that band had been in the punk scene the whole time too. It's just now they're making like this kind of music, I feel like it's maybe just like a more forgiving kind of place in terms of what people are willing to accept. It's like, oh, you're doing this now? That's weird. That's cool. You know, it's like no one's going to be like, oh, I wish that you were still, you know, playing this kind of music. It's just more, I think there's just more of an ability for people to kind of just like expand what they're doing, but still stay in the same like ecosystem, you know.
Yeah, I find it interesting when you look at a place, New York, because you have so much stuff happening, but it does feel like everything's very much unto itself, you know, and everything's very much in isolation. Like, you know, like looking at the period where I guess where even you're moving up there, you know, you have like all this crazy sort of like noise rock stuff happening at the same time you have all the Revelation straight edge stuff happening at the same time you have scum rock stuff happening, and yet it feels like everything is its own little fiefdom.
Right. Whereas like if you or I moved to New York in that time period, we'd be going to see all that.
Everything.
You know,
I want
like,
to see everything. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, I'm going to the CB's Hardcore Matinee, and I'm going to see Sonic Youth, and I'm going to see, you know, the Cocteau Twins or whatever. Like, you know, I'm just trying to see all this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what was it like moving up there? Like, because you went up there for a year, basically, right?
I was up there. I went to college there starting in 85.
Okay.
And then was there for 2 years and moved back to North Carolina for a year off, like a gap year basically, and then moved back to New York for another 2 years. So I was there from like 85 to 90 essentially, with a year off in the middle, where I still went up there a lot during that time just to visit friends and see bands and stuff. So it was an awesome time to be in New York. And it was, I mean, I went to Columbia, and the campus is very far uptown. And they had some good shows on campus. I saw, freshman year, I think I saw Volcano Suns, Husker Du, The Liars, all kinds of good stuff on campus. But of course, the real temptation was, you know, let's go downtown or let's go out to Maxwell's every weekend to see bands, which gets expensive. And I mean, if you remember that, I don't know, you're too young to know that era, but shows didn't end till like 4 a.m. or something. It was just crazy, you know. So you're on the subway like 4:30 in the morning, just going like, but and
also it's no joke going downtown at that point too, right? Like a lot of people have come on the show, talked about like John Ross Bowie talked about how he got mugged like 4 times just going to shows as a young kid growing up in New York.
I think I got lucky. I mean, there's definitely neighborhoods that you were more sketched out to be in, some more than others, you know.
Which is where the punk venues tend to be, right? Like if you're going to CB's or something.
Yeah. But no, it was, you know, it was amazing, and just such a wide range of places to go. You know, like there was CB's, and then, you know, Rock Hotel would put on shows in different places, sometimes at the Ritz, which is now Webster Hall, but there's a lot of kind of the bigger shows there, like Motorhead and things like that, you know. Mm-hmm. But it was, I mean, for someone coming from North Carolina, it was very much like, oh my gosh, you know, like all these record stores, all these shows. It was pretty amazing place to be, for sure.
Well, especially someone like you who's got a wide breadth of tastes, right? Like it's not just like you're going to just the CB's matinees. Like you want to see the Volcano Suns, you want to see the Liars, right? Like you want to see all this stuff, and it must feel like, yeah, it's like a punk rock wonderland, especially that period. Like that's a period we're obsessed with. Like when I say we, I mean Chris O'Toole, who does Footnotes with me, and like that period of like New York, because it's post everything kind of happening, but it's where you have all these little scenes not interacting necessarily, but just happening at the same time. And so many cool people, so many interesting people come out of that world, you know, like Fred Armisen to Brooks Smith was just on the podcast. Like, there's just so many people that are like coming drawn to this thing like moths to a flame, you know, and then eventually doing things cool and culture outside of that.
Yeah. And, you know, like there's New York bands, and then of course every touring band plays in New York, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the first matinees I went to after I moved up there was De Kreutzen at CB's, and there was like hardly anyone there. I was on a tour for the first album, and there were incredibly great. But that's how you meet people also. You just notice like, oh, these other 5 people are going down the same subway as I am for this show, and then that's kind of who you end up like hanging out with and finding out about other bands and other shows and stuff that are happening.
Was like, did you bring Slush Puppies up there? Were like you guys keep the band going in New York? Were you doing shows up there?
We never No, we never played up there. That was because the other people in the band were down here in North Carolina, and we would kind of play when I was home on vacation, and just play shows here and there. And I was actually texting with our drummer Jonathan today just to try to like jog my memory about some things, but yeah, we played a few shows, and I remember, like, or maybe the biggest shows we played were a little bit later, opening for Fugazi. We played with Fugazi a couple times. Like Fugazi's 3rd show was in Carborough at the Cat's Cradle, and we played that show, and I think Days Of played that show too.
I think so, because the flyer's in the merge book, and that's where that the amazing Minor Threat on the flyer story is.
Oh my God. Like such an idiot.
I don't think you should feel bad. I was like, of course you would put Minor Threat on the flyer. Like, it's just like the most Ian thing to be mad at a kid for putting the Minor Threat thing.
It was only their flyer. 3rd show. It was like, no one's going to know who it is unless we tell them who it is.
I know. It's just like, but it's such an amazing story. I love that story in that book.
I made a second version of the flyer for sure. What was I saying? Yeah, so we were still just like North Carolina, and like I think that Slushpuppies, and then also the other band that I was in around that time, Wwax, WWAX, with Wayne from No Labels and Brian Walsby playing drums. We were most active in that year when I took a year off from school and was living in North Carolina, and we played a bunch of shows and made some recordings and put out the box set with the 5 different local bands on it.
Yeah, like that's I love that box set, but I love the Slushpuppies single because there's also, and I wrote you about this before because I found it when I was in Boston. There's a version of that 7-inch from the box set with a separate sleeve, right?
Yeah, because we had like extra, when you press records, sometimes they make extras. So we probably had like 50 extra 7-inches, and what are we going to do with them? So I just made some like Xerox sleeves for those, and then some other recordings we made got released like long after the band had broken up on Leopard Gecko, or is it Meat Records? I can't remember.
Meat Records, I think, put it out.
Meat, yeah, it's
but
the
Leopard
same
Gecko...
guy, Steve. He had two names for the label, I think.
Oh, because Leopard Gecko did put out the Wwax 7-inch,
right?
Too.
Yeah, and then changed it to Meat.
Yeah, which is a great Leopard Gecko Records label is a really cool label.
Really great Melvin single on there.
A fantastic with Brian Walsby art.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's amazing when you think about Wwax as being this band with, yourself and the New Labels connection. Then of course Brian Walsby, just like the Rosetta Stone of music, able to connect so many disparate scenes and worlds of bands and stuff. So
and Walsby has such a good memory. Maybe it's because he writes a lot of stuff down, or maybe he just has an amazing memory. But I've often, when I'm trying to jog my memory about something, I'll end up on some blog post that Brian Walsby's written about, a certain show that I was trying to find out about or something.
You need those. You need the archivists for the scenes to help you remember this stuff, because the reality is, like, it wasn't that documented. Like you're saying, like it like if it wasn't for a radio station playing bands on carts, like a lot of this stuff would remain completely unheard.
Yeah. Yeah.
So was that Slushpuppies stuff that was played on the radio on that cart? Was that the stuff that would wind up on the Slushpuppies first tape? So
I was in a band in high school that we started out as I joined a band that kind of existed already with a couple guys from my high school who were the rhythm section, and their mom was a music teacher. Their names are Mark and Greg, and they were just like insane musicians already in like 11th grade or whatever we were in. And the singer was a guy named Scott Clark, who's the older brother of Ben Clark, who was in a band called A Number of Things, like a local hardcore band that was they put out an album on Fart Blossom.
Oh yeah. Okay.
But so Scott was my age, and he went to a different high school, but So they had this band, and I joined this band, and it was they were originally called the Pneumatics, I think, and then we were called Pneumatic Underground. And we mainly played covers, and we kind of got together. If I remember correctly, the first thing we played was the talent show at Chapel Hill High, which was kind of like a big deal. And then that same year, Dexter Romweber played the talent show and was like amazing. But the talent show at Chapel Hill High was like a big deal, and we got together, and we learned mainly a bunch of like covers. I feel like half of them were from Erg, A Music War. Like we saw Erg, A Music War, and we're just like, yeah, we should just learn like 5 songs from this, and that'll be most of our set. like we covered Athletico Spiz 80 and Echo and the Bunnymen and the Pretenders and the Police and like all this stuff. So so that was that band. But we did have after a while a few original songs, and we recorded them at a place called Lloyd Street Studios in Carrboro, which had a 4-track reel-to-reel. And those songs got put on a cart at the radio station. And so we didn't play a lot of club shows. For one thing, we were really young, and we weren't together that long, but we did get to open for Tommy Keene, which was,
whoa.
And we got to play with the Connells. Those were kind of like our biggest like shows at clubs. So we got to play the Cat's Cradle and the Brewery, which was awesome, in addition to like playing a bunch of parties and stuff.
So that would have been Tommy Keene just kind of freshly solo, right?
I guess so. And he was, I mean, maybe he wasn't here more than anywhere else, but it felt like it because he was on Dolphin Records,
yeah.
which is based in Durham. So he wasn't local particularly, but his label was. Yeah, and he was awesome. I mean, Places That Are Gone, like those first couple EPs got played a lot on the radio around here. And so yeah, so there was this kind of like I mean, it's interesting now thinking about that, starting a record label in Durham in 1982 or 3 or whatever that was. But they put out a couple compilations called Mondo Montage and then More Mondo. These are like comps, mostly kind of like new wave kind of things from around here. But again, like they got played a lot on the radio, and so those were pretty influential, I think, for like the local scene. Anyway, so our band did get played on the radio, and then when we finished high school, we kind of like everybody did their own thing, and we didn't play together after that. But I was, that was really my first like band that ever played like in a club or whatever.
I always thought that band was called the Slushpuppies too, for some reason. I didn't
know Slushpuppies was like I was like friends with Jonathan, who was the drummer for the Slushpuppies, this whole time. He's like, we were best friends basically, and we played music at his house all the time because he lived on this farm, and so you could make noise at any hours of the day.
Yeah.
And but we never had like a full-on like band until I went away to school and then came back, and then we started Slushpuppies basically.
I think It's a Music War is super underrated in the impact it had. Like those bands, and like just it's something that I guess maybe because it's never been, I guess, formally reissued. I don't think, I
don't think it. I mean, they probably can't get the rights to like half of those things at this point. But some of the footage, I mean, some of those clips are just insanely great. Klaus Nomi, the Klaus Nomi clip alone.
Mm-hmm. The Cramp stuff.
The Cramp stuff is insane. The Gang of Four clip is insane.
Yes.
So there's like a lot of good music on that thing. But again, like if you're, 15 and you go see that for the midnight show or whatever, and you're just like, holy shit, like this is like a whole world of stuff out there.
Mm-hmm. And it really is like, I don't know, for me, it's like almost like that first sort of punk explosion. Like this is it coming to fruition. Like these are all the bands that kind of like came out of it, and this is all the different sort of sonic spaces it's taking up right now. Like I think that is such a, and it's so funny, like reading the Miles Copeland book and hearing how that movie came together. And I don't think he ever put as much weight on it as I think people have put on it since it came out, type thing. Like, not that he didn't take pride, I think, in making it, but it just feels like I don't think he appreciated necessarily at the time how much impact that thing would have in the long term.
Well, I also feel like England is such a weird place. in terms of how they think about their bands, that like I think by the time that came out, a lot of those bands were probably just like completely disregarded by English music press or fans or whatever, have moved on to something else, you know. But I mean, so the thing is though, if you're living in a place like this and you see these bands, you're never going to get to see most of these bands live, you know, unless they become as big as the Police and play like an arena near you, which they did. But I mean, most of those bands never did. So what's the thing that you can go see? You can go see like other punk bands that are like your local punk bands, you know, at like all ages shows. Because even if a band like, I don't know, like if Gang of Four did tour around that time, like they were definitely playing, they probably weren't coming here first of all, but they would be playing in a bar most likely, you know. So, you know, so again, like hardcore shows is where we were going to see bands, and a lot of that had to do with Corrosion of Conformity being here, you know, because they were quick to go out on tour. I think soon after they started playing out of town a lot, and then met a lot of people on the road, and then those bands would come through here and play, and a lot of times CSC would be on the bill too, but not always. But it's just like that's what kind of put Raleigh on the map, I feel like. I mean, Charlotte, a lot of bands played Charlotte also, but that was like a little far to drive for us. It was about 3 hours at that time. And there's a funny detail that when you read stuff about CSC, they talk about is that Reed's dad had a bit, and my dad and Reed's dad went to college together, which we didn't put together until I'd known Reed for like years or whatever.
Yeah.
He was like, my dad was like, what's his last name? Mullen? Oh, I went to school with a guy named Sandy Mullen. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. But Reed's dad had a Wwax line in their business, which is basically like a reverse 800 number. Like you can call anywhere long distance for free.
Okay.
And so they use that to be able to like book tours and stuff. So they had this like resource where they could just like call people all over the country, bands, clubs, whatever. And like that kind of like helped them build their network of bands that they knew, which is really fun. Which is really funny. I didn't know about it at the time, but they talk about that in interviews and stuff.
Well, it's funny, like the economics of early punk is something that I'm also becoming really interested in. And the idea that like you had to find a way to make it work because it was so expensive to do this thing. Like how much you would know better than I would, but how much did it used to cost to book a fucking tour just in long distance bills? Like before you even got on the road to pay for the gas and all the other stuff. Like,
oh, I know, just like hundreds of dollars. I mean, I don't even know, like when I think about the first time that Superchunk went on tour, I'm just like, how did those shows even happen? Like, how did they even know that we were definitely going to come to that show? Like, It's just like, it's so weird, you know, like it was like pre-fax machine even, you know?
Yeah. Oh, especially in Canada, because that border, you know, when the band got up to the border, you know, anything could happen. So you'd be sitting at the venue and there'd be no way to contact them, no way to call them. Like, you know, one band got held up at the border for 4 days, I think it was, you know, and like you're just sitting at the venue like, well, they no-showed us. That sucks. And then little did you know that they're meanwhile getting their life ripped apart at the Canadian border.
Oh my God. I mean, to me, that was one of the coolest things about going to hardcore shows where there were bands from out of town, was that it seemed so exotic. It's like, this band drove here from California. Like that's insane. Like I remember seeing SNFU. I knew where they were from, and I was just like, oh my God, like they're here in Raleigh, you know? And I mean, they were one of the greatest hardcore bands that I ever saw, for sure. Just like live bands, insanely amazing. I saw them a couple times. But I mean, just to think about like what it took to like book that tour and get to the East Coast from Vancouver or wherever, like just like the whole thing is just kind of wild when you think about it now.
They're almost a band that I think is more revered in America than they are in Canada. Like because they toured and because they got out there and it was easier. Yeah. I think we realized it early on too. Like it's easier to tour America than it is Canada. So them in DOA, it seems like there's more reverence for them, I find, in America than Canada.
I mean, DOA also was just so full on live. Like that's what I wanted to see. You know, like that's a band. It's like you're going to see, you know, especially because they were pretty big by the time I was seeing them. That was in New York. So it was probably an expensive show, whatever. and you want to be blown away, and like they would blow you away.
I think one of the coolest things ever is watching you and Jim cover "Fuck You" at that driveway to driveway. Yeah, on acoustic. But because it's just like, I don't know, like, you know, this is way pre me doing this podcast, but for me, it just kind of drove this point home. Like, oh, punk does connect everything. Like, here's Superchunk playing this song that song also, this guy Simon Harvey, this is his theory, so I don't mean to take credit for it, but that song traces the history of Vancouver punk to hardcore through it being covered. First, it's a Skulls song. And then it's covered by Subhumans do it. Yeah. And then DOA does it. And like how you can kind of like trace the evolution of this song. And then here you guys are covering it at a movie theater on acoustic guitars in Toronto.
Right.
on one of the coolest nights of my life, too. That was a fun ass night.
That was really fun.
That is a night that will live on in infamy in my mind, you know. But
but yeah, so you know, like once I moved to New York and then came back and for a year and we put those records out, then it was kind of like, oh, like you can just put records out. You know, like that was like such a cool thing to do and such a fun local thing. And I think that it also made me realize that, like, because, you know, usually, like, again, if we're trying to go see bands at clubs, like it was often touring bands, you know, because that's who people will get excited to see. But if you, like, when we put that box set out, we did a couple, and it was, so the box set was Slushpuppies, Wwax, Angels of Epistemology, Black Girls, and Egg. And none of those bands on their own could draw enough to, like, fill us what was at the time a very small Cat's Cradle. It probably held like 250 people or something like that. But when we put that box set out, we had record release shows and like sold out the Cat's Cradle and sold out the brewery. And it was like people were coming to see these like weird local bands. And so that was a very kind of heartening thing, which I felt like, you know, before that, to be a local band that was like filling clubs, you would have to be like, I don't know, maybe kind of fratty or just like super poppy or something enough to be on the radio, you know. And none of these bands were like that. And people still came out. So that was that was kind of like a cool learning experience, really.
When you're building a scene, right? Like it's something that is completely different. Like I find there's like the closest thing would be DC, just like in the way that DC kind of has this sort of, you know, like this scene that's kind of like built and kind of like, it feels like it was tended to and kind of like helped and nourished to kind of grow that way.
Well, and I felt very inspired by the DC scene. I mean, it's funny because if you read about No Labels and COC, like they had songs that were like kind of slightly like anti-DC songs, because like they are, you know, they would say, you know, when they went to DC, they were kind of looked down upon as like these Southern like rednecks or whatever when they would go to a show there, and the people in DC were all kind of like well dressed and wearing creepers and I don't know, just like slightly snobby or something like that.
And that's not unique to them. I've heard that from other people. Nancy from Philadelphia and Boston, Nancy Burrell, talked about it on her episode too.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
So and whatever, like they had built this thing that was like super great, you know, like they had the Discord, they had these amazing bands, and so they did have this thing. It was enviable. But when I went to college, I met a woman named Lydia Ely, who was from DC and in the scene and really good friends with a lot of the people in these bands. And so when they came to New York, they would stay with her often in the dorm. And so I got to meet, that's how I met Brendan and Guy and Ian and people from those bands. Seeing like what Rites of Spring was doing and Embrace and those bands, and was super inspiring, because it was like they were kind of like remaking a scene. Like they had a scene and then like all those bands broke up and then they're like doing it again, you know what I mean? And they had an interesting way of kind of like not really self-mythologizing, but kind of like making a big deal about what they were doing. Like when there would be a show with remember going to see Happy Go Licky or something at 930 Club, and they had like a giant painted thing and like flowers and like all this stuff, and like it was just kind of more of an occasion or something, which I think like really made everyone involved more feel more stake in it or something, like more like they're part of something. And so I found that part of the DC scene really, really inspiring and cool.
It's there's such a flair for drama in the
I guess
DC
that's what I'm
scene.
describing. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
But it's funny because like it's always taken up, and when I think of it, it's always like such an austere, like, meat and potatoes kind of scene at every point. Like, obviously they're doing art, but they're doing it in like, like a very kind of like, this is Protestant work ethic kind of way.
Yeah.
But there is such like a melodramatic kind of flair to everything, like bands smashing their gear, like this is our last
Yeah.
show ever. We're gonna
Yeah.
burn all the copies of this demo so no one could ever hear it. Like it's very, very, very dramatic in an amazing way.
I mean, I think I had that same idea about the austerity until I met people in those bands.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, these are like the biggest goofballs, And like, whatever, they named their band Happy Go Licky. Like how, how much goofier could you get?
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually, I mean, we were lucky. We got to play with them. Slushpuppies and Days of went to play the DC Space with Happy Go Licky. That was amazing. But I think that the other thing that I think kind of is like a in between, like a connector in some ways from us to DC and just other kinds of music was the Richmond scene, which is like it's like much closer to here, and so bands from Richmond would come down here and play, and we could much more easily drive to Richmond to see a band, especially if we had to drive back after the show because it was only 2.5 hours away. And Honor Roll was kind of like, to me, like maybe the greatest band of that era in terms of a band that like I saw like a million times, who were like always great, always interesting. The records didn't do them justice, even though I love those records, but just super inspiring as a band that was in the punk scene for sure. And the first record is first 7 inches kind of hardcore-y sounding, but like they immediately just like started doing all kinds of weird stuff and super cool songs. And the first time I saw them was they were opening for the Minutemen at St. Joseph's Church, that church basement that we were talking about earlier. And I'd never seen either band before. I'd heard the Minutemen because I had double nickels, but like seeing both bands in one night was just like, my mind was so blown like by each band. I was like, wow, I just saw like my 2 favorite bands now for the first time ever and in the same night, and they're from wildly different scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that Honor Roll is just like a huge influence here. I mean, for sure on my bands, but I think on a lot of people's bands, and then we were lucky to get to eventually reissue that stuff on Merge and work with some of Penn's other bands. And Bob Schicks and the Choral, that we put out the Choral, first Choral single as well.
Yeah, I love those records, and I think they're like, but they're one of those bands, like you're saying, that anyone you talk to from that area is like, oh, but you had to see them live. Like it was like a different experience than even the records.
Yeah, and moving to New York and getting to see Honor Roll and Corrosion of Conformity in New York was also very validating, because you're going to CB's and like there's all these people there to see these bands that like about, but you don't really know what the wider world thinks of them. And then there's like all these people there, including Gerard and Thurston and people that you respect, and you're like, oh, like other people get this also. It's so cool,
Yeah, yeah. Like it feels. It feels like it's funny when Kevin Seconds was on. We talked about this idea of like you need almost like ambassadors of a scene to kind of like go out there and, like you were saying about COC, to kind of like get the name out of the scene. And there's certain cities that didn't have that type of band.
Right.
And it's almost like the scene's a little more forgotten because of it. Like you needed almost like a flag waver from each city to kind of be like, this is where people should go. This is where the other band should take up and tour. And because it's not documented so well, this is how the legend spreads.
Yeah. It's true.
How much connection was there to the Atlanta scene?
I mean, Neon Christ was really like what I was familiar with from Atlanta, and I saw them.
Did you ever see a band called the Restraints?
No, I never saw that band.
Okay, they seem to be the Gigi Allen of the South, as
Oh,
I'm
really?
learning
No, I
about
don't
them.
think I don't think I ever saw them. I saw Neon Christ and they were awesome. Um, and have that single, but I don't think I ever saw the Restraints.
I,
Atlanta's like, I mean, it's literally 6.5 hours away. Like it's really far,
yeah,
and especially um driving back then, like I don't know, like it felt like another thing and just like super far away.
but Charlotte's a lot closer. But I've always heard that that was like a completely different world.
Charlotte is a lot closer, but also, yeah, just feels like a totally different place. Like they had a couple of clubs that got like a ton of shows, and there are some good bands from there. But like I think No Rock Stars was from Charlotte. They were on that No Core tape, which is like kind of the first North Carolina hardcore compilation. It had No Labels, No Rock Stars, Cold Core, and oh, maybe Stillborn. Oh, Corrosion.
Corrosion, yeah.
But I think the rock stars were from there, and they were really great. But I never got to see them live or anything.
Hmm.
But yeah, Charlotte, it's a banking city, and so like the vibe is different. Anti scene was from there, obviously, and so like they had a reputation, but they were that was like
It's like a separate
feeling
world.
thing. Yeah.
But then, but because as I understand, it's like Raleigh, Durham, it's like and Chapel Hill. It's like one kind of scene.
Yeah, because everything is very close to each other. you know
Mhm.
um the, Raleigh's the furthest from Chapel Hill. That's the furthest distance, and that's like 25 miles or something like that. So all that, yeah, it feels very connected. And then once you start to get to Greensboro and Winston, like that's a little far. They have their own kind of scene, and then Charlotte's like even further.
So outside of the DC space, how much touring did you do with Slush Puppies and even
we
Wax and stuff?
we never did any touring. Like Wax, the furthest Wax went was we went and played a show in Greenville, South Carolina. There was a club that in 1987 or whatever year this was still had something called New Wave Night. And like we went and played a show there with the uh what are they called from Richmond? I think the other not the other mothers, that's Greensboro.
I'm
Other
trying to think.
neighbors? Something neighbors. Oh my gosh. John Moran was in this band. He produced a lot of great records. Anyway, I
I'll
can look
fix it
that
in the
up.
intro. I'll put that in the intro.
Okay. Yeah. Uh, but anyway, yeah, we went to play to like 5 people in Greenville, South Carolina. That was like the most touring we did. We mainly played around here. And Slush Puppies, I think the furthest we went was we played DC, and then we got to play this amazing college show with Fugazi at Dickinson College, which I think is in Pennsylvania. And that was like the extent of our kind of like touring. We just mainly like played around here.
How much did you see the world kind of change for this music in that sort of like 90 to 91 period? Because like obviously, people come on the show and talk about, post Nirvana and just like how everything changes. Like, and it seems like you guys are just forming just at the beginning of this thing kind of happening.
Yeah, so like Chunk and Merge started in 89, and we would drive to New York and play a show. I remember we drove up and played like CB's Canteen or something like that on New Year's Eve, 1989. And uh, put out a couple singles, and our first tour was that next summer with Seaweed and Geek, and we went as far as like Minneapolis. Um, but again, all these bands had was like 1 or 2 singles out, and it was kind of amazing. Like we still had some great shows, which was a little bit like, wow, like there's all these people here in Chicago to see us, or Minneapolis, like people are coming to see us. But there's also shows where no one was coming to see us. Because again, bands with like 1 7-inch out, like how do people even hear about that?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was still pretty like haphazard, I feel like. And like we're talking about before, you're booking these shows on the phone and, sending physical press materials in the mail. Uh, so I just think it was still very like you never knew what you're going to get when you arrived in Louisville or wherever, you know. Um, but I, in some ways, it's hard for me to judge because by the time we really started touring, we also had an actual booking agent, and we had signed to Matador Records, and so other things were happening that were making us probably seem more real to the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
But I still feel like it was like touring is for a lot of bands who don't have an album out or just have one record out or whatever. It's very hit and miss, you know, some amazing shows with tons of people and you don't even know how those people like know about your band, you know. And then other shows where there's no one there, but you can still have a fun show, you know. It's just like the running the gamut of like what an early tour is like.
I guess it also depends on what's happening in a town on any given night. Like if there's nothing going on, you could like win the lottery and everyone could be at your show because people were bored back then and nothing else to do.
I mean, I think that one thing that really helped us was this series of connections we made with other bands, either bands that had played here or you know, when we did that tour with Seaweed and Geek. So now we knew people on the West Coast, you know, with Seaweed, and we knew people in DC, which was Jenny Toomey and Derek and Kristen in Geek, and at Simple Machines people basically. And so, and through Seaweed, we had a, you know, I think Aaron was living in Olympia at the time. So like you have these little footholds or whatever, when you know, when you get to this town, okay, there's going to be someone there, you know. Or Aaron from Seaweed, I remember saying like, oh, you should stay with my friends in Albuquerque or wherever. Like people would, tell their friends to come see you or tell you to like call their friends when you're in their town. And there was a network of that sorts that all existed via the phone, I guess. But you know, because it was pre-email, but it existed in this way that kind of gave you a little bit of a, well, at least when we get to this town, we know someone, and that'll be a cool place to kind of like hang out for a couple of days or whatever. And I remember for our first show, and I think it was our first show in San Diego, we played with Pitchfork, I think. And so, you know, that then we got to know Rick and John from Jehu and Rocket, and you're just like making these friends because you're all into the same kind of thing and paying attention to the same zines or radio stations or whatever.
Yeah, John talked about that when he was on the show, about playing with you guys and meeting you guys for the first time, and just how, yeah, like it's so, I think that's the great gift that punk kind of gives music in a way, is just the idea of like touring on the cheap. Like, you know, like you didn't have to wait for a booking agent, you didn't have to wait for a club to kind of book your show. Like you just do it on a network of friends. It's like that DOA Black Flag phone number thing that you just pass on a phone number, and then Max Rock and Roll book your own fucking life. Like it feels like,
for sure,
that's the thing, that's the greatest gift, because that can be applied to any type of music.
Yeah. And so I think that, you know, having, for better or worse, having a positive experience at least part of the time makes you like keep doing it. You know.
Yeah.
And you're kind of hooked on that. You start getting in that cycle of like touring and seeing the same people in different places, and it's really fun. And then you know, it can become a thing that you're just like, oh, this is just what we do now every year, and we're trying to make records at the same time, you know, and that can be a burnout at the same time. But especially when you're first starting, you're much more willing to like sleep anywhere and be uncomfortable and, you know, play anywhere, and, you know, it's pretty exciting time.
Yeah, you know, the stuff you're willing to put up with to make it happen. Now this has finally happened. I don't want it to stop, Mac, but I've kept you for a very long time and I could talk to you forever. But will you come back for a part 2 at some point in the future?
Of course. In part 2, we'll get into the 90s.
Well, before I let you go, though, I got to find out a little bit more about your involvement, because you are a bat. You are a member of the Bats.
I did play on a Bats record.
Yes, I didn't even realize I own that 7-inch, and it wasn't until researching this episode did I listen to that record all the time, and I'm like, holy shit, Mac plays on this too. That's
Yeah.
crazy. How did you first become aware of that scene, the Flying Nun stuff? Because you do a
So
Verlaine's cover super early on that 10-inch too.
yeah. So when I was at school, I was in New York. I was at school with a guy named George Balukas, who he and Patrick Amory had a fanzine called Too Fun Too Huge,
Mm-hmm.
and and through them I kind of learned about, and also, you know, Forced Exposure would review a lot of these Flying Nun records also, and I was like reading Forced Exposure cover to cover. And in fact, that's the only magazine I ever got in trouble for having in my bedroom at home was Forced Exposure.
What issue?
It was an issue where there was some like one act plays by like Nick Cave and Lydia Lunch or
Oh my
something.
god!
And my parents were just like, can you not leave this around for your little brother to find? Anyway, so like, but so they reviewed a lot of these Flying Nun releases, and George and I and Jonathan Marks, who went on to be in Lamb Chop, like we would go record shopping together, and we were often looking for Flying Nun stuff. And so that's kind of how I found out about Flying Nun in the first place. And then when I was taking a year off from school, I was working at the record store, and so I would try to get Flying Nun stuff in when we could, you know, through Dutch East or whoever was importing it at the time. And I was like obsessed with that made up in blue 12-inch. And then the Bats came over for I think their first tour, and they were playing Maxwell's, and we were living in North Carolina at the time. But I was like, we have to drive up to New York to see the Bats. So Laura and I drove up. We did a road trip to New York, and we eventually went to Boston and some other places. But the whole thing seems like it was kind of based around going to see the Bats at Maxwell's. And in anticipation of that, I made some T-shirts. I like home silk screened some T-shirts with the Made Up in Blue art on it, and brought some to the band. And I had like, in drying the ink, I kind of like burned some of the shirts in the oven, so they like weren't even that great looking. But anyway, I homemade Bats merch and gave it to the band themselves. I don't know what I thought they were gonna like do with this, wear their own shirts on stage. I don't know. Some
That's
bands
like,
do that, I guess.
but that's super flattering. Like to see that someone put that effort into your band. Like, you know,
Yeah, it was
Jason.
fun.
Well, Jason was just on, New Darcy, and he was saying that he used to just cut out Bob Mould press clippings when Bob would come to Chicago and bring Bob all these press clippings.
The
And
press
so,
clippings, that's so good. Oh,
but that like endears you to the band. Like you got to kind of be a Punisher to
yeah,
get in there, right? Like we all know that's the reality of this thing.
right. So we did that, and so we kind of met them then and became friends a little bit or whatever. And then they ended up signing to Mammoth Records, which was based here in Carborough. And when they're on Mammoth, they came through town and were here for a while, like hanging out. And I was like, and I guess they were recording that EP, Spill the Beans, at Duck Key Studios when it was still in Raleigh, where we had made the Slushpuppies records and the Wwax records and all this stuff. It was in Jerry Key's house on Bickett Boulevard, Bickett Street in Raleigh. Anyway, and I was like, wow, it's so cool. The Bats are like making this record in Duck Key Studios. And through hanging out, they asked if I would come play guitar on this one song. And so I think that like I play guitar, and I think that maybe Paul Keene was like operating the wah wah pedal like while I'm playing a solo or something like that. I was just psyched to be like hanging out with them. And then I got Kay to sing on a Portastatic record around that same time that I was making at Duck Key, which again was just like dream come true. So and so we've just been friends with them since then. And we ended up putting out a Bats EP on Merge, and playing shows together, and yeah, it's always awesome to see them.
Yeah, they're just one of those bands that like the first time you hear them, you're like, how is this? How have I not heard of this? Like, how is this not
Yeah,
like the most well known shit?
and they're still making amazing records. Their most
Yeah,
recent album is just great.
it's wild. Like they got like Superchunk, like there's a few bands that are good, for a long period of time where you can actually grow old. Like we're talking about like scenes growing old, but like bands that you can actually mature with and like still like don't let you down.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, and bands like that are an inspiration. I mean, they're I think of the McCaughan's in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
We played with them. We opened for them one of our first shows in Chicago. Maybe like the second or third time we were there. We opened for them at the Metro, and I'd seen them already in New York when I was living there, and they were already legends, obviously, and they're just one of those bands that no matter when I see them, they're great, and I'll listen to anything that they put out, and they're super inspirational in that way.
And I think they're a band that, like, because they are so storied, like, people I don't think always see that whole story. Because, like, they're with Gang of Four when that stuff's starting, they're still relevant the whole way through. Like, it's amazing when bands are able to do that.
Yeah.
Well, this has been amazing to be able to do this with you, Mac. And
great to see you, Damian.
Anytime, buddy. Anytime. I'm going to start bugging you for part 2 tomorrow.
All right. We'll do it.
We had to get back on to get a screenshot, and Mac and I were talking, and we got one more story.
Right. Well, so you were talking about like stuff that I heard on college radio that then I got interested in, and one of the bands was the Meat Puppets. When Meat Puppets 2 came out, they were playing it on XYC, and they were playing it especially because they were coming through town. They're going to play at the Cat's Cradle, and I think that one of the things that's interesting and unique to this place is the continuity, especially in Chapel Hill and Carrboro, because the club scene in Raleigh has kind of changed over the years. Like the brewery's not around anymore. The Fallout Shelter's not around anymore. A lot of the places don't exist that people used to play. But the Cat's Cradle, though it's moved locations, is still here. This was it's not its oldest location, but this is like its second oldest location in a very small spot on Franklin Street. And the Meat Puppets were playing. And so even though I knew that like I was not old enough to get in, like we would still sometimes just try to like go and see what would happen. So went to the Cat's Cradle, like they, I couldn't get in. So I'm hanging around outside, and then they pull up, and I guess they didn't sound check. I guess they were just like arriving at the club like in time to play or whatever. Who knows where they had driven from. And I went up and like said hi or whatever, and they're like, "Are you coming to the show?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm not old enough to come in." They're like, "Here." I don't remember which brother it was, which Kirkwood. He's like, "Here, like just carry these and just like act like you're our roadie." And so like I'm like however old, 16 or something like that. I'm like walking behind them, like they're just these really tall guys, and I'm like just walking behind them carrying these guitars into a place I've tried to get in like 100 times or whatever. And so like I just feel this giant hand on my shoulder as I'm walking past, and it's Billy, the door guy, who's this huge bouncery looking guy. He's like the friendliest guy in the world, but he's very intimidating looking because he was a football player.
Yeah.
Just like feel his hand on my shoulder. He's like, "Where do you think you're going?" You know what I mean? Like I was like, "Well, I tried, but I just thought it." And then usually what happened is like Frank or Billy or someone will be like, "Okay, like you can watch like a song or something, and then like, and you can have to stand right here by the door, and then like you've got to go because we can't get busted with you being in here underage." But I thought it was so cool that like the Meat Puppets were like, "Sure, we'll try to get you into our show." Like we don't, you know what I mean? Like it was just an awesome moment of like kindness, like they didn't know me from anyone, they're just like dudes far from home on tour. But the fact that like that was the same club where like we still play now, in Carrboro, I just think is like I said, I think the continuity is important and really helps kind of like build a scene,
Yeah, it's that continuity too, like that idea that like that's the thing. Like punk bands show up and they're playing a 21 over 19 plus show, and there's a young kid there. They're going to try and find a way to sneak that kid in, not to like get that kid drunk, but just because everyone knows that's the power of this music is these kids want to see it, and you got to help them see it.
Yeah, and they were probably that kid at some point too, so
yeah.
like they understand,
Yeah, absolutely. And also I meant to ask you, did you have any interaction? Because you used to identify as straight edge with the whole straight edge thing that was kicking off in New York at that time too?
Oh, no, I was never straight edge.
Okay, in the merge book, they describe you as a straight edge dreadlock punk kid at one point.
Oh my
Someone
God.
describes you as that. So,
It was definitely not straight edge. I mean, I wasn't going crazy or anything, but I was drinking beer or whatever.
yeah.
No, we used to, I would occasionally see I was kind of, those were the bands like late 80s, like early 90s New York hardcore bands. Like I wasn't that into that scene.
Hmm.
But I would go, but like one of my favorite record stores to go to at the time was Some Records. I don't know if you've ever talked to, I don't know if he's still around, the guy who ran that store, Dwayne, I think his name was.
Legendary store.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And walking distance to, there wasn't a ton of record stores in that neighborhood in particular at that time in the East Village. And so like, we would, when we were going to a show or going downtown in general, we would try to go by Some Records. And I think that his thing was like American punk only or something. He had some weird restriction on his, like what he carried in his store. Or maybe it's like he only carried hardcore. I don't know. Like
I think it's only hardcore, maybe.
Maybe it's like he only carried hardcore. Yeah. And like I remember buying some Misfits records there and things like that. Like, but he was just a really interesting guy to talk to. And you being there and Thurston or someone would wander in, like it was a cool little, like it felt like it was part of a scene. It wasn't really my scene, but it definitely felt like it was part of a scene.
Well, anytime you want to be part of this scene again, Mac,
All right.
we're always looking for scenesters.
I will be back in the scene for sure.
Thank you, Mac, for coming on the show. And you heard right there, Mac will be back at some point in the near future. And check out The Sound of Yourself, Mac's brand new solo record, an amazing album, out on September the 24th on the home label, Merge Records. Coming up later on this week on the show, returning to the show, my buddy Derek from UXB Press is back. Derek, of course, was part of the amazing team that put out Tomorrow Is Too Late, the Toronto hardcore punk in the 80s book. If you did not pick this thing up, and unfortunately both printings are sold out now. Hopefully there'll be more coming, because this is an authoritative book on Toronto hardcore, and the crew has returned with Eve of Darkness, the Toronto metal in the 80s book. And let me tell you, I don't know, I think this might top the hardcore book. And I love the hardcore book. And obviously the hardcore book sonically is closer to my heart, but this thing is incredible. Like, this is the authoritative book on Toronto metal. And Toronto metal, that covers a pretty wide swath of music. And we talk all about it on this next episode. I'm very excited for you to hear about this thing. I learn a lot. This is an area of music that I do not excel in my knowledge of, but it's something I'm very fascinated with. So yeah, I'm stoked for you to hear this. That will be coming up in a few days on the show. And that is it. Remember, as always, Black Lives Matter. The lives of Indigenous peoples matter. We need to protect trans kids. We need to help trans people protect themselves. And there needs to be a halting, a stopping, a ceasing of hate and violence towards Asian people and people of different faiths and different nationalities, and just knock all this shit out. Because, as I say, this isn't political. There's elections happening all the time. There's a lot of political stuff, and this stuff does get tied into political stuff at times, but this is just basic human rights stuff. Like, people just deserve the right to live freely and as who they are. So get involved. If you see something going on in this world that you don't agree with, research what's going on. Find out if there's organizations that are addressing it. See if you can lend your support, however that is, in person, financially, if you can't do it in person, or if you have the ability to do it financially, whatever, just go there and do something. Speaking of doing something, doing something creative. Make a fanzine, make a band, make a podcast, make a record. Just lots of stuff you can do, because anyone can do this stuff, and making something makes you feel good. You know, it doesn't have to be something that ambitious. Maybe just make a drawing. Maybe don't show anyone. Just do it for yourself. Since we're on this self-help kick right now, why not try meditating? I didn't believe in it, but it really does kind of work. And I should really research it more and look into it more because it is really beneficial. And I strongly recommend trying it, even if you're someone like me who thought it was hippie bullshit, even though it's, you know, a practice that goes back centuries and centuries and centuries and has all this history. But if you still are someone who, like me, and was just like, whatever, it's hippie stuff, try it. You know, who knows? Sign your organ donor cards because they don't come for that shit until you don't need them anymore. Don't worry, they're not going to show up in your house like that Monty Python sketch that was ripped off by You Can't Do That on Television, like wholesale ripped off by You Can't Do That on Television. I remember seeing this sketch as a kid. My dad's like, this is completely ripped off, this Monty Python sketch. And then seeing this Monty Python sketch. Anyway, sign your organ donor cards because they're not going to do what those sketches say they're going to do. And I think that's it. Stay safe. Maybe I'll see you in Chicago. Maybe not. I'm sorry I'm not going to see you guys, some of you people, in some of these other places. Maybe next time. All right. Thanks for listening.